Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this month's Tech Talk 2020. Aran and I are joined today by Dmitry Sotnikov, the CPO of 42Crunch, for a panel discussion on API security. But before we go there, if you cannot hear us, yes, we are talking. You do need to connect to your telephone audio. There's an audio panel on GoToWebinar where you can locate audio and select to your phone if that's the way you want to call in. Dial in using the information provided, not what I'm showing on the screen, but the information being shown on your screen. And once you're connected, you can enter your audio PIN to identify your line. At that point, you are successfully connected via phone. If you drop for any reason, simply reconnect. On your control panel, you can expand or collapse the panel based on the size of system you're using. If you're on a tablet, it's very handy to go ahead and collapse it. Simply click on the arrow one way or the other. You can view and select your audio as I just described. Also, very importantly, there is a question or comment field. Please do enter questions. We will be doing Q&A toward the end of this session. And finally, this session is muted for recording purposes. This session will be available on API Academy later on today. I also wanted to throw out real quickly a reminder. We talked about this a few weeks ago. API Academy is offering the industry's first independent education and certification program for API strategy and design at no charge. It is a personalized, self-paced course for API designers available today, API security architects available in June, and API product managers available in the July-August timeframe. The whole idea is delivering proven best practices on demand. Each course completion and passing the exam will give you a certificate and badge. If you complete all 3 courses, you will receive an API Academy certified badge. That's the gold one at the bottom of the screen. We highly recommend and ask that as you accomplish these efforts and receive your certifications, by all means, post them on the API Academy page on LinkedIn, share your accomplishment with your friends and colleagues. Also, as a reminder, API Academy went through a rather heavy update earlier this year. We now have a how-to section. Aran's team is actually key to this section. It's basically asking or answering frequently asked questions in the form of a blog and, if necessary, a very short video to demonstrate best practices for common tasks. We also have a regular content cadence, including contributions by industry thought leaders, both internal and external. And we are doing complimentary virtual, and we were doing worldwide in-person training this year, but we have postponed that due to the current situation. We will be, in 2021, the global sponsor for API Days, and we'll actually host API Academy workshops in person. We will be doing a virtual session sometime in early summer, and you can visit the API Academy events page for details. And with that, let's talk about API security and some really cool breaches that happened. I'm not going to go into all of these, but whether you're Snapchat or Equifax or whoever you are, this is not where you want to see your name in the paper. These are situations that not only drag your company's name into the mud, but that tends to be, in today's world, very financially costly. And invariably, it's because API security was considered something that was an afterthought. And I'll give one really good example of that. I'm sure you guys have all heard about the Jeep takeover a few years ago as part of an experiment. But another one that is just where security is an afterthought because developers don't think security. The Nissan Leaf is a great little vehicle. They actually have a cool mobile app that you can use to talk to your car, turn it on, start the AC, exception. And basically this took place over completely unencrypted, unauthenticated APIs. The way that Nissan's engineers decided to tie an app to the vehicle was using the VIN, which is actually very clever because the VIN is totally unique to that vehicle. However, the VIN is also totally viewable by anybody walking over to the driver's side or the left side of the vehicles and looking into the windshield, which means that I can take that app, download it off one of the app stores, plug in that VIN, and I now have full control over that vehicle. So again, API security is oftentimes an afterthought. And with that, we've asked Dmitry Sotnikov, the CPO of 42 Crunch, to talk with us today about some of what he sees. I got to give him a huge plug. I first discovered or got in contact with Dmitry because he publishes a weekly newsletter, which if you're in the security field or you're in the API product management field, is incredibly valuable because it basically says, here are the issues that came out last week that could directly impact your business or how you're doing business. So with that, let's jump right into Q&A. Again, plug in your questions as we go. We will be doing them toward the end. One of the first questions I have is actually for Dmitry. There's an upcoming Open API 3.1 release. Why do I care? And for that matter, why do other security standards really matter in my space? Did we lose Dmitry?
I think we did, Bill.
Uh-oh. Well, I apologize for that, people. We'll give him a minute to come back in. Let me just double check and make sure that he's not scrambling to get in.
Oh, he's back. He's coming back
his
in.
Internet dropped. He's coming back in now. Okay.
Who'd have thought working from home can be so interesting?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I had to jump to my phone, so hopefully
No
that will
problem.
work.
I just briefly described your newsletter that you put out once a week. Hopefully you can tell us how to get onto that disk list. But I just asked you a question. There's an upcoming Open API 3.1 release. Why do I care? And for that matter, why do I care about any other security standards?
Yeah, so where do I start? So we care, and you should care a lot. So first of all, APIs. So there are good things about API security and bad things about API security. Bad thing is that we have lots of APIs now. They keep changing all the time. It's hard to keep up and keep them all secure. However, the great thing about APIs is that unlike regular web applications, APIs, REST APIs, they actually have a machine-readable industry standard describing effectively API contracts, and that's Open API specification that has, I think, 40+ members in the Open API initiative, which is a Linux Foundation initiative. So it is an industry standard with all the major players like Google and Microsoft and others behind it. The reason why you should care and try to use it is that it is machine readable, so your tools support that to different extent, but they do, right? So you can get the tools that you use for API testing, the tools that you use for API development, the tools that you use for API security. They can all talk the same language. And then secondly, as long as you follow the standard, as your tools implement the standard in the same way, then again, they talk the same language and they can enforce those standards. If you don't follow the standards or you don't follow them well, then you can be potentially in trouble. You can mean one thing when describing the API. The tools can interpret it differently, and then hackers can find a discrepancy. It's like that there was an issue a few months ago when a system got hacked because of the way that they were implementing HTTP headers were not correct. Like in HTTP headers, you should not use spaces around the colon, and then people were using spaces, and hackers found a way to get in because the blacklist was not interpreting the headers the same way that people were meaning to, and so on. So that's a big thing. And then 3.1 is coming soon. You can go to the GitHub site for Open API specification. The big new things are that they are updating JSON implementation, so that there will be some There will be some incompatibilities with the previous OpenAI specification because of that, because JSON schemas are changing. But it will be a more consistent implementation and more up to date with the current state of art for JSON. And then finally, mutual TLS is also in, which is great. A lot of mutual TLS authentication is what a lot of microservices and APIs are using. So now that there will be a way to implement those in a standard way and describe those in a standard way.
Gotcha. Another question is, can you explain DevSecOps and API security?
Okay, so DevOps, so we all know DevOps, right? So DevOps helps a lot make us as developers a lot more agile. And it became especially important with the whole microservices architectures proliferation when we now have many teams working on the same product and doing all their little bits and pieces, little microservices, and being able to iterate on them quickly and ship weekly or daily or hourly and get out all the small changes that they want. However, in that kind of architectures and in that kind of approach, security and API security becomes really important, because basically microservices all have APIs. They talk APIs to each other, and the communications between the components, which in the good old days of monolithic applications, we used to have objects and classes, and they were all talking to each other, but within the same computer and same processor and same memory. Now they are talking APIs to each other, talking over network. And so hackers can potentially get to your application not through the UI, but through the APIs of those individual microservices where you're not expecting them to get in and hack into your system. And because of that microservice approach, you have thousands, hundreds or thousands of APIs, and not just a couple of APIs that you can sort of really well manually test and design and review and so on. And so DevSecOps is the answer. You use that pipeline, the DevOps pipeline, and you implement your security checks, your static analysis, your dynamic API testing into that pipeline, and your policy updates for the production deployment. And so that way you can keep staying agile, and your developers can keep iterating very quickly. And at the same time, you can ensure that all the changes to your APIs and all the new APIs still conform to your standards of security for your company.
As a add-on to that, I was just working with one of my colleagues over in the semantic security division at Broadcom, and he is getting ready to publish an ebook on DevSecOps and is including a chapter on API security. That's what I was working with him on, so stay tuned for that. Let me fire one off to Aran, and Dmitry, by all means, chime in. What is the minimum I should do to protect my API as far as security goes?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. One of the first API security kind of calls I did for Layer 7 back in the day was with an English government department. I'm not going to give you any more details than that, but we were talking to them about, implementing an API security gateway and what they were going to do, and their minimum was not telling anybody the API existed, which was clearly not enough, right? So we talked to them through that, like, how are you going to authenticate the user? How are you going to authorize the user? And for their environment, that was going to be a big problem. So we looked at what are the absolute minimum things you should do. So we talked to them about doing some schema validation, right? They're going to be having requests coming in, and they might want to schema validate the payload and also validate the parameters and information that are coming through to protect that back end. We also talked to them about rate limits, putting rate limits and quotas in place so that they know they're not going to be overloading that back end with people once they possibly find that API. So they were they were some of the things that they'd not even thought about that I think are key. We also talked to them about what was going out, right? The response is just as important as the request. So yes, we can make sure requests coming in the right format, but what if they found something in our API that dumped all the data? So we also talked to them about putting message limits, message size limits on both the request and the response to do that. But typically, our customers would go a step above that, right? They would have TLS, so that the secure communication for the API. And normally there is some sort of authentication and authorization level, whether that's pure API key and secret because it's an app-to-app kind of conversation, or a more complex thing involving a user and some sort of credential for that user.
I would add on, and we're going to be talking about this extensively next month. Minimum would be also to protect yourself against the OWASP top 10. And I noticed that Joe Kroll is on today, and he will actually be the guest speaker next month, and we'll be diving into that pretty heavily. Anything to add to that, Dmitry?
No, I think you guys covered it pretty well. So again, first of all, make sure that you even know all your APIs. I talked to many companies, obviously, and a lot of companies, they sincerely they lack proper discovery process, proper DevSecOps process. So they don't even have a clear understanding of how many APIs they have and where these APIs are. And then, yes, you need to have a consistent process of making sure that that your bases are covered, that you have authentication, you have authorization, you have request validation, response validation, all the things that you guys have just mentioned.
Gotcha. Why are web application firewalls failing for REST API security? Now, my first answer to that would be because I've worked with web application firewalls, and unless you have a rocket science degree, configuring them is absolutely impossible. But besides that, what's your take on that?
So yes, besides that, yeah, I mean, the problem with web application firewalls is that they have been designed in a different era, right? That they were designed for web applications, and mostly their approach is that they give you some blacklist rules, so that they give you some ability to sort of see things like SQL injection, some sort of known patterns, and then they, to your point, Bill, that they give you a way to give you custom rules and custom policies. And now imagine you have hundreds of APIs, and all of these APIs have all the whatever JSON payloads that they should be accepting or should be rejecting, and so on, and the responses, again, to Aran's point, responses that are okay, and everything else you want to block. How do you do that? How do you create those thousands and thousands and thousands of rules describing all of those things, and how do you keep them updated with your agile processes? It is just not possible. So you end up with a web application firewall that is there, but there's some API call, REST API call going through it with some JSON payload, and this thing has no idea whether that's the JSON payload to the endpoint that is expected and supposed to go there or not. And so it just lets things through. And there's no way you can manually configure all those things for all those APIs.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill, I remember in the early days, I used to work at IBM, and when web services became a thing, somebody at Microsoft famously said they're firewall friendly, which what he meant was you open a hole and you just let anything in the payload go through. And although those firewalls have evolved a little bit, they're really not down at the message level. And anyone that hears Jay Thorne from our organization talk about the strength of an API gateway, is it really should be message at the message level, at the content level, and also API aware. So yeah, I always remember that story because I think it was it was just such a crazy thing to say. it's firewall friendly because you just open a hole and let everything flood in. So yeah,
that's friendly. Got to give them points.
yeah. Well, the firewall doesn't complain. Yeah.
So another question is, and this is for either one of you, what's your opinion on machine learning and artificial intelligence versus defined API contracts and rules? It's an interesting concept.
It is, and I mean, I can understand why it is an appealing concept, because obviously we are seeing AI and machine learning very successfully used in a lot of areas, right? Especially all those things like image recognition, some pattern recognition, and as we already mentioned, APIs are proliferating and systems are becoming more and more complex. So it's sort of appealing to use AI to so AI would figure out what's the proper use for your application and your APIs, and then some kind of recognize the sort of abnormal rogue scenarios and block them, or at least alert you. And there are a few problems with that. A is that to work well, you really need, for any machine learning, to be able to give a good training set to the thing. And for APIs, you don't necessarily have a good training set. Because how do you get large volume of legitimate traffic to the thing? Do you generate that traffic artificially yourself in the lab? In that case, it sort of defeats the purpose. If you have your own well-defined API usage thing in a machine-readable format, then just use that. If you take it from the wild and the actual traffic, then I don't know how you would get large volumes of legitimate traffic that would not have any rogue calls in there. From my experience, whenever I do demos, I can create a new endpoint, don't tell anyone, just start using some endpoints for my demos, and within hours or sometimes minutes, I'm seeing some rogue traffic and some I guess automated scripts, etc., trying to break it to the scene and find some known vulnerabilities and so on. I think I saw some research from Sophos on their honeypots for REST APIs and for web endpoints, and they were saying that they were seeing rogue traffic starting to hit their endpoints and honeypots within, I don't remember, less than a minute, like 50 seconds or something. So there's no such way, no such thing as large volumes of totally legitimate traffic, and so that's sort of hard and not really possible. And then on the other hand, you can have things that are sort of anomalous, and you just in your regular life cycle of API, you had API that was always getting some parameter between whatever 0 and 100. You made a change, now it is 0 to 200. But when you roll out that new API, that's an anomaly or whatever, or you have your holiday sales, and so the traffic is legitimately up, and things like that. And so even worse, obviously, if it is not I mean, you asked about predictable models versus sort of APIs and versus machine learning. Again, if it's a predictable model, your partner is calling you saying, well, my calls are rejected now. You can say, well, they are rejected because you're not using my API correctly. Here's what you need to change. If it's a machine learning thing, you can just say, well, our machine learning algorithm is now flagging your calls as rogue, but we don't know why. So again, it's harder to maintain. And I think finally, my biggest problem with machine learning and AI in security is that it's a little bit of a magical thinking. It gives people false sense of security. They start assuming that they can design the APIs in whatever way they want. They don't need to security test them. They don't need to do anything. There's just magic, some AI magic that they can apply on top in production, and they'll become secure. And clearly that's never the case. So I think there is space for AI for abnormal detection and use that in addition to what you do for API security. but I would be really opposed to people just using AI instead of everything else for API security.
I would totally agree. Now, Aaron, you just touched upon this one just a few minutes ago. Is schema validation a waste of time?
In my opinion, no. Like I said, I came from the days where we had SOAP and XML schemas and those kinds of things, and that was a given, right? That was one of the reasons that when you were calling a SOAP request, you knew that the request was well formed, it was coming in the right format, etc. So, maybe that's an old school opinion. I still think it's a really key thing. It's a way of stopping unknown requests or badly formed requests at the edge, in an API gateway or wherever you're doing that filtering. So I think it's a must. There is there's always a balance there. If you have a ridiculously large message or a crazy complex schema, then you can get into the stage where the schema validation is taking maybe too long, longer than the application or the API is taking to process the message. But I think it's important, and like we said before, it can be just as important on the request and the response to trap bad requests and bad responses. There are other things people do, right? For APIs, they'll also check the parameters, the headers, and the structure of the message outside the schema. But I think it's quite important to really do that. Where the expense becomes too much, it can also be done at more granular level. So with message formats like JSON and XML, you can actually just schema validate the part of the message you want to look at or the thing that you think is most important. But yeah, I don't think it's a waste of time, but it can be a big amount of time processing at the API level. Yeah.
Gotcha. So here's a question for both of you that we all know tends to be ignored. How do I authenticate IoT devices? Certainly the camera makers tend to say, you don't need authentication. Just use the IP address.
Yeah, it's like that proverbial joke of S standing for security in IoT acronym. IoT security is really important, right? Because in a lot of cases, IoT devices, they are actually like they can potentially affect your physical security, right? There was that for example, that there was that vulnerability in smart hot tubs about a year ago, right? There is such a thing as smart hot tub that apparently some people buy so they can manage their hot tub from their smartphone. For example, I guess on a windy winter day, on your way home, you can get your hot tub ready for you, I guess. But the problem is that the way that security was implemented there was very poor. You could just they had some security for the API in this thing, but for that security there was a hard-coded password, and the username was the name of the Wi-Fi hotspot embedded in this thing. So basically, your neighbor could start controlling your hot tub and potentially boil you if they don't like you or something. So those things, and then obviously there are, again, cameras and things like that. So you don't want any random people to be able to start watching you on the security camera in your bedroom or something. So security is important. There are now some emerging standards in IoT security, and some governments are starting to put out some legislation, some standards. I know that the state of California has some now, and so on. So obviously no hard-coded passwords ever, no open endpoints. Always try to do a combination of user authentication and device authentication. A lot of devices have built-in ways to have secure certificates on the chip to make sure that you can authenticate both. I don't know, Aaron, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think to me that's the one that sounds the best, right? Which is that the device during the registration process creates a certificate and then you're managing that device. And the nice thing about that is the device and the hub or whatever it's talking to have a secure communication that you can not only rely on as device to device, but can control. You know, I love the hot tub example. I'd not heard of that one, Dmitry. My wife is actually diabetic. She now wears one of these patches, and you know, we were reading up about it because it's an investment in what you're going to do and how you're going to treat diabetes. But you know, I was going down into the technical level to work out how the heck that was connecting to her iPhone, and whether I trusted it or not. So yeah, there's some serious things out there. But I think, you know, those standards that are emerging are really, you know, are really needed, because you know, I play around with you know, some home automation stuff, and some of the stuff I've got in the house, I'd rather not have on, right? Or I'd rather not connect, or I'd rather not expose it to the external services that people want to do. And I think it's really important. I do think that device registration is the key part of that right now. Like you said, if there's a user involved, that's important. But a lot of times with an IoT device, there isn't a user involved, and hard-coded passwords and usernames are worse than useless. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that. I also have a smart home, and I have a smart pool and hot tub system tied into it, and which I love the authentication methodology when it's on wireless. But if you want to come from the outside, basically, if you know the physical address of the device, the default password is blank, which I just was totally thrown off by why you would do that. But so I get what you're saying. Because that was the first place my mind went, is great. Somebody can drain my hot tub, fry my motor, or turn it up to 150 degrees.
Yeah.
But here's another interesting one. This is a little bit of the near future. What are the new elements of OAuth that are being driven in the API space? That's probably for you, Dmitry.
Yeah, so on the OAuth, there is OAuth 3.1 coming, 2.1 coming. You should go and again look it up, just whatever, Google it or see it, see the story that you had on the APIsecurity.io website. It is not really a completely new standard. It's rather taken the OAuth 2.0 framework and then applying all the current security best practices to it, like using PXE and so on, and no longer allowing the grant types that are not secure, and so on. So the whole idea behind that is that basically OAuth is by now relatively old established standard, and to properly implement it these days, you have to go through not just the original specification of the framework, but a lot of add-on RFCs with the current security best practices and PXE and things like that. So I would recommend just going and looking into OAuth 2.1 specification. It's a one RFC that covers all the latest security best practices, and make sure that the grant types that you're using and the additional measures of security within the current grant types, like code grant type and so on, are up to date, and you are using the latest security best practices.
Gotcha. Here's another question that is really impacting a lot of people around the world today. How are containers and their possible short lifespan affecting how people secure and audit their API environments?
Okay, so I think we touched a little bit of that earlier. So the biggest problem with containers and serverless is that there's just a lot more APIs than what we used to have, right? Again, when I started working with REST APIs many years ago, there were companies had really few APIs. Like we would, as companies, we would have, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 5 APIs, and they would very rarely change. And so we would be able to, and our customers would be able to go and review those APIs and making sure that we have proper security audits for them and everything. And then you design those and you're good for a few years, and actually as long as you can, just to keep compatibility with your customers and API consumers. And so this changed a lot with the containers and the microservices world and later serverless, just because there's a lot more APIs now and they keep changing all the time. And so that's the biggest impact, that you have a lot of APIs. A lot of these APIs also have direct access to your sensitive data, and those APIs are sort of your internal APIs. And a lot of companies, unfortunately, they think that if an API is an internal API, if it's an API of some microservice, then security is not as important because it's internal. So no one would ever call that API apart from your other microservice being developed by your friend sitting in the next open space, or I guess these days with confinement in another in his or her house. But you know that person, so that there's no way that person would abuse your API. You trust your other microservices, you trust your colleagues, and so a lot of these APIs, a lot of these microservices, they are not secured. People just don't realize that these things are communication over network, and attackers can figure out how to go directly against one of those microservices. So there's no such thing as an internal API that doesn't need security. You need to care about security of all those APIs and all of those microservices and apply the same standards. And again, so there are some additional measures of security that you can use for microservices, like you can use mutual certificates for authentication. You can probably use some network level security with a service mesh or something, etc., etc. But you do need API security on those things.
I'd absolutely echo the internal security not being as important conversation. It's massive. I think one of the other things we've seen in that space as well is visibility and governance, because if you're running your API in containers using auto scaling, things like service mesh, that API could be on 2 containers, it could be on 10 containers, and knowing which containers were running and which APIs were being called and how they were being called and who authenticated with them is really important. So we've seen a number of our customers that are looking to move to those kinds of architectures, really questioning, well, how do we log that API was used, right? Because if I log that to a container that spun up and then spun down, and someone actually hit the vulnerability or tried to hit a vulnerability while that container was up for a number of minutes or hours, then there's a real issue there. So we're seeing that the governance and visibility of API use and API security is something that's really key for those customers as well.
Yeah, and I would recommend, for those of you who want to follow up more on API security, especially as it relates to microservices, after the session is over, go hit up API Academy, go to books, and you can download a book actually specific to microservices and API security. I think this one is for Aran, because this sounds very much like a layer 7 question. How do I validate the AMI for the gateway since it's in the community marketplace?
Okay, so I mean, my first question would be, to a certain extent, why? I mean, we validate and security test the images before we upload them to the marketplace. So it's not it's not an open thing. It's the image that we've created. And when we create our API gateway, that's what we're known for from a security perspective. So I think there are some tools out there where you could validate the AMI gateway, but at an image level, everything should be fine and as configured as expected. Of course, we always get asked, how do you test your API gateway, right? Well, the generic level, I want to test that what ports are open, those kinds of things are fine. The more complex testing is of the API once it's up and running and how you've configured it. So those things have to be done afterwards. But the actual AMI itself, there's, it's an image that we use from our hardening. For anyone that knows us well, we, FIPS certified and common criteria certification is something that we go through on a regular basis. So yeah, I think that's the answer to that one.
So this is a three-parter in essence. How should I monitor my APIs? What data should I monitor? And how do I know if my APIs are working properly? Those are all directly related to each other.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the with the last one. So on the APIs working properly, again, I think that open API specification is the way to go. I think that kind of whitelisting approach, defining the proper behavior of your APIs, again, to what Aran was talking about, defining as specifically as you can. So both requests and responses. Don't just say it's this path and this this operation, but go into defining the actual parameters and schemas and whatever. If it's a string, give it a regular expression. If it's an integer, say that it's an integer and here's the minimum value, maximum value, and same thing with the responses. Just define. Do it in a machine readable format and standard format. We had one customer that is a fairly big bank in Europe, and when they started working on the API security, and we asked them whether they had their APIs documented and defined, and they said, of course we do. And then they brought us a PDF document. I'm not kidding, like a very, very detailed, like 100 pages PDF document. Brilliant. Yeah, they're describing all the inputs and outputs and example, but not in machine readable format, right? So they spent time, many hours producing that document. That is sort of useless. It's kind of useful if you are, I guess, an API consumer. You can use it, I guess, just to learn about the API as a reference, but it's useless from security perspective. So define your API, but define it in a way that your tooling would understand, and again, in a way that is standard across many vendors, and use that to make sure that your API is working properly within that intent that you had for your API. And then I can guess add. I'll let Aran add whatever you want.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of parts. There's monitoring from a security perspective, and also monitoring the API in general to know whether you're being attacked from some other way, whether it's a denial of service attack. In our Broadcom solution, we talk about two types of monitoring. The first one is what I would call inside out, which is really looking at how the API is performing down at a very granular level across the components that you've got. So whether that's an application server, a database, an API gateway, really being able to see as the transaction goes through what it's doing and what it's being called, what the parameters are, and those kinds of things. And absolutely, that can be used to look for security issues, right? If someone's putting a parameter that is way too big, or putting injection attempts into that into those API calls, that can definitely be identified and spotted and highlighted to whatever kind of reporting or alerting system you want to use. The other solution we talk about is outside in, which from a developer experience side, knowing developers consuming my API, knowing how they're seeing the API perform and what it's doing is really important. So the outside in approach really takes us to the cloud, and we do automated testing on an API on a regular basis, and that can be automatically built from a Swagger or an Open API definition, and we can add things to that, like sending unauthenticated requests in and making sure we get error messages in the 400s. We can send authenticated requests in, and we can actually look at the responses that are coming back to make sure the API is performing exactly as it should be. So from a content perspective and from a performance perspective, we can see what the external developers can see. So, yeah.
Gotcha. So this next question, you have to look at it from a pure security perspective, no other methodology. Should I put my gateways on premises or in the cloud?
I mean, I can have a go at that one if you want. I mean,
Yeah.
My response would be yes. If you were, yes, you should. I mean, really, you should look at where you need the security and where the assets that you are securing are determined, right? I mean, if your assets are all in the cloud, there's very little sense putting and the traffic is coming from the cloud. There's very little sense in putting an API gateway on-prem. Likewise, if all your assets are on-prem, do you really want to go into a cloud that you don't control and then back into your environment? So I think my rule of thumb is, work out where the traffic is flowing and what it's doing, and then make sure you put the API gateway in the right place for that traffic. So there's no right and wrong answer specifically. There's also a call that you might have data in the cloud, which most people do. Most people have some sort of SaaS provider, and you need to integrate with that from internal systems. In that case, where do you put the gateway for that? It could be an internal on-prem gateway that's controlling the access to the outside. It might be that your SaaS provider or your APIs need a gateway also in the cloud. So yeah, where do I put them? What's the best way to put them? It really comes down to where the API is for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we at 42 Crouch, so we are not an API management company, so we don't have an API gateway, but we do have an API firewall that people add in their line of traffic for the additional security, for API security. And again, our recommendation is very similar to that, to what Aran just said. Put it to make sure that you minimize the impact, the overhead, because people do care about the API performance. And especially in the world of microservices, again, you have your components talking to each other over API. And a lot of people, if they are using some sort of an API gateway that is far away, they would not obviously route their traffic through that thing. And so microservices now become insecure. And so again, if you have centralized API, make sure that your API gateway, API firewall is where the traffic is going anyway. If you are on microservices, for example, we have a mode for our API micro firewall to be used as a sidecar proxy that you can have within the pods in your whatever Kubernetes deployment or another deployment. So put those things as close to your actual code and data as possible to minimize the hops, to make sure that you get security, but you don't get the impact from performance perspective.
Yep. Okay. Here's a couple from the audience. Let me see if I can read this correctly. What is the best practice we can follow to secure our API? So before I turn that over to you guys, I'm going to say the best practice, first step you can take is to go to API Academy and pull down our resources on API security. That will definitely give you some of the best practices in the industry. People like Scott Morrison have dug seriously deep into what those best practices are and lay them out in various blogs and videos. So with that, I'll turn it over to you guys to see if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I guess now I'm obliged to to push my API security.io website. Again, has lots of resources there, and the weekly newsletter and encyclopedia. So again, we've talked about sort of the basic things about API security in the beginning of that conversation. Make sure that you have process of API discovery for all of your APIs, that you have your security testing and security assessments going within your DevOps pipeline. Make sure that all your APIs have authentication, that you don't have APIs without security, without authentication and authorization, that you follow OWASP API security top 10, and then you do data validation. And so that would probably, those things would get you like whatever, 99% along the way.
Yeah, guys, I don't have anything to plug as blatantly as obviously I'm part of the API Academy, so Bill's kind of got my plug in. The only thing I would add to that is, we hear a lot about API first, and we can debate whether it's really API first or a use case first. But I would say that think about security all the way through, right? Even with the inclusion of an API gateway or an API security proxy, still think about what needs to be secured in your API. Think about, hey, I'm creating an API, the back end's a database, or the back end is what threats do I need to protect about? So, I would say that yes, all those things can be done afterwards, but if we think about security during the development phase and the testing phase, and then into publishing and deploying, then you're going to be more successful than just thinking about it at the end. Too many organizations I've worked with in the past, the API gets created, gets designed, built, and then the security team come down and say, hey, you've got to do this, and sometimes that can cause problems, and if they don't come down, of course, then maybe you're exposing vulnerabilities. So I would think about it all the way through the API lifecycle.
Okay. Here's another question that came in. I'm going to try and parse this into where it makes a little bit more sense. Can a lot of microservices in a single transaction lead to network latency because of HTTP or HTTPS over the network as compared to a single ESB?
Yeah, I think we covered that earlier in that webinar. Then yes, of course. So again, microservices, since they are typically in a single transaction, a single operation, you can have a lot of microservices talking to each other to produce that operation jointly. So a lot of people, they face that dilemma of either just not securing them at all, because they say, well, if we route all of them through gateway, then just like that question mentioned, that the impact can be simply too high because of all of those network hops and so on. And so my recommendation is to not sacrifice security, but just find a way to implement that security in a way that would not have that impact. So making sure that, again, your microservices only talk to microservices to which they are supposed to talk. Again, use mutual TLS authentication between them. Use network level policies using service mesh or whatever you're using. And again, obviously, again, as someone working at 42 Crunch that has a product for that, a sidecar proxy mode for the API firewall, I obviously would love to for you guys to use that as well.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And this one can go out to either one of you. Should I use SAML with my API security model?
So I'm not, frankly, I'm not seeing SAML used as much these days as REST APIs and security there with again, REST APIs, JSON, OAuth, JWT. So I think that REST APIs initially they were very simple, and there was no proper security model for REST compared to SAML. I think REST APIs evolved a lot, and I think if you are using current best practices for REST APIs and OAuth and JWT, as long as these are implemented correctly, following current security best practices, you can have high level of security without having to go back to the SAML days. Aaron, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just jump. I would put it down to the consumer, right? If if you have a partner or a consumer of your API that really can't evolve from SAML, then there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It can be a fantastic use case, but most APIs in the world of microservices, the world of web apps, IoT, it really doesn't fit well with the developers that are trying to consume it. So yes, you could use it, but do you really want to put your developers through that when there are better standards, the things that Dmitry just talked about that fit better, are just as secure, if not more secure, and are actually designed for REST? So yeah, I think we don't see many requests in that space. We then get into, well, why don't we swap SAML, right? We can do things like swap SAML for a JWT, for instance, and we get into that kind of use case. But I guess the answer is you could use it, but why? Why would you do it? Why would you put people through that pain? Yep.
Fair enough. Okay, with that, I'm gonna call it a day for this particular webinar. I want to thank Aran, as always, for joining us today, and especially for Dmitry to take time out of his day to answer questions and join us on this panel. Dmitry, if you send me the link to sign up for your API security newsletter, I will post that in the blog when I post this video up on API Academy later on this afternoon. So with that, thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good, safe day and weekend.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks,
Thanks,
Dmitry. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.